Hello guys, this is Svetlana from Outriders Cosplay, and today I'm going to show you how to build a really cool outfit from Outriders. In my last video, I showed you how I built the legendary weapon, the super cute Grim Marrow. And yeah, this was already a commission from Square Enix, and I also had to create a fitting outfit. The only problem was that I had only 3 weeks of time. And yes, the game is full of amazing armor sets and they are super cool and all, but with so less time I had to pick something more simple. So my choice was actually the outfit from the character in the box art. I think it still looks pretty awesome. It's also very dirty and post-apocalyptic and I love it. So today I'm going to show you how to build a whole outfit from scratch. Outriders the game is already out, and the really cool thing is that you can loot the Grim Marrow as well as my outfit in the game, and I think that's pretty sweet. And yeah, if you want to try it, you can also just play the demo if you want. And if you also want to try out cosplay, I, by the way, have plenty of tutorial books. One of them, for example, is my Sewing for Beginners book. So if you need some help, just grab it on cosplay.com as a physical version or a download version. And now, enough of talking, let's start crafting.
For costume reference, Square Enix sent me this rendered front view image of my character. And yes, I indeed only had the front view to build everything. So this whole project involved a lot of guessing. As the only addition, I also got a screen recording of a similar armor in the game. But since the outfit there looked actually very different, the back of the costume was just a wild guess to me. So this would be quite challenging. And no, I wouldn't shave my hair. When you boot up the game, there is a character creator with plenty of cool hairstyles. So I will just choose one of those. But for now, let's finally get started. I first began with the poncho, since it's the most iconic part of the costume. However, I had no idea how to make the pattern, so I tried to create a fabric dummy with some leftover material first. This technique involves random pattern drafting and just hoping that the result will somehow work out. As you can see, with a little bit more cutting here and there, it looked already pretty good. Yay! I think this is a really easy and fast technique to make patterns, and I use it for many projects. Afterwards, I grabbed my fabric of choice, which was a thick beige cotton, and traced all those shapes onto the material. The funny thing is that once I'm working on the floor, Zelda and Midna think it's playtime, and they do their best to get my attention. Okay, they are really cute though. Next, I just pinned all these parts together, sewed along here, and folded the edges with my lovely fabric clips. Yes, they are called fabric clips, since I know you will ask that. More sewing. In the reference, this upper edge looks pretty stiff, so I cut out a long stripe of fabric, folded it, ironed it, added it to my scarf thingy, and sewed it on. This was the result. So far so good. Now the rest of the poncho. Zelda and Midna did their very best to be extra cute. Well, and you know the drill already. The fabric was a little bit stiffer, but I just hoped it would still work out at the end. My sewing skills aren't really great, so I experiment a lot and just give my best. For the poncho, this was luckily enough. Yay, the base looked really nice so far. Then it was time for the details. Here I made a paper pattern. For this part, I used this amazing metallic platter, which I bought in a random fabric shop ages ago. After cutting everything out, I covered the edges with fabric glue and folded them all around. You'll notice that I used this glue quite a lot in this project. It's called Gütermann HT2. Amazing stuff. I used it also to secure the leather pieces onto the poncho. Then I only had to sew along the edges. For the next step, I had to get a few extra strips. Ta-da! All self-made. And afterwards, more glue. My poor sewing machine had to get through all those layers. The poncho also required a few eyelets placed all around its edges. They don't have any purpose or make sense, but they look cool. Yeah, I added plenty of them. Some details were still missing, but I was already quite happy with the result. Okay, next came the top underneath the poncho. I recognized here only the sleeves, but it was enough to figure out the fabric. For this, I used a store-bought pattern and just traced my size onto transparent paper. Oh my, this part is super boring, but at least I know the patterns will work out. I used my shiny blue metallic platter for most of the top, but also a stretchy thick jersey to keep it comfy and breathable at the end. And again, Zelda tried it really hard. As you can see though, she was pretty successful this time. Did I already mention that I totally love my sewing clips? Anyway, so far so good. Now to the next step. Finishing the sleeves. I connected the edges with my clips and this was the result after sewing. Next, I had to attach them to the shirt. Sleeves look always super weird at this point, but once the sewing was done and the dog was cuddled, they looked pretty fine. Now I only had to fold over the edges and added a nice finish with my sewing machine. So this was the complete shirt. And here goes the poncho on top. We are doing some nice progress, yay! Now the arm guards. As you can see, the main reference wasn't really helpful here. So I tried my very best to figure out some details and shapes in the video footage. Again, I made a paper pattern and traced it onto faux leather. After adding enough sew allowance, I cut the fabric out and covered a piece of interfacing with a good amount of glue. Afterwards, I added a second layer of fabric to the back and finished everything on my sewing machine. Then I turned it inside out, added a further seam, and this was the bracer so far. Yes, this was supposed to be a bracer, believe it or not. Then more glue, a further piece on top, and some eyelets for decoration. I highly recommend not hammering those holes at 2 AM in the morning, by the way. Looked already more fancy, right? Then I added a final seam just here, and this was then my bracer so far. Bracer, yes! Now I couldn't really sew them onto the sleeves anymore, so I glued them on. This glue is just too amazing. Then I also made those thingies. I didn't really had a good image of them, so I just made up my own design. Glued them on as well. Then Benny added some red paint here and there and hit our vinyl cutter for some fancy details. I got then this perfectly cut emblem, which I carefully placed onto my bracer and ironed it on under protective baking paper. Just had to peel off the foil on top. Now I also added a random number to a thin strip, covered it with glue and placed it onto the bracer as well. Yes, this looked very nice. So these were the final sleeves and arm guards. Now to the protective vest. From the video, I knew there would be something on the back as well, but the design looked quite confusing. So my creative freedom was required again. This time I used duct tape and my dress form for pattern making. Oh my, you get to see so many different techniques for this stuff in this video. But here, I roughly drew the shape on and did the back the same way. Then I peeled off the tape and cut my pattern carefully out. So far so good. Afterwards, I traced the shape onto fabric and added here a thick layer of interfacing. I love the stuff to build up volume and thickness. As you can see, I kept the sew allowance free and then clipped on a second layer of fabric onto the back. Next, I sewed all around the interfacing. Just had to make some cuts here and there, and then I could turn this thing inside out as well. I used the same technique for plenty of pieces of this costume, as you might already noticed. The clips were already a great help to place the last seam around the edges. The front part was pretty much the same, but was slightly more complicated because of the booby curves. As you can see, this works for plenty of shapes. So let's speed up this part a bit. Some clips here and some sewing there, and the front of the vest was done as well. Next, I placed some marks and added a few decorative seams. On top, I also used one of my markers, which did a good job to highlight them. And then eyelets. Plenty of eyelets. I honestly wonder if people will even notice all those details, but this looked already so much better than the plain fabric before. Well, and here was the almost finished vest. Something was still missing, but you'll see that later. The next step was the shoulder armor, or whatever this was supposed to be. I wasn't really able to see much in the main reference, so I tried my best to recognize it from the video. For the front pieces, Benny drew me a helpful blueprint in Illustrator. The side and the back of the armor was a little bit more tricky though. I drew some freehand patterns here and there, cut them out and attached them piece by piece onto the poncho. This helped me to get an idea of the right size and the right shape of each armor part. So this was my paper dummy. Afterwards, I traced all parts on 5 and 10mm high density EVA foam. This material is quite durable but lightweight and I love working with it. I only needed a sharp blade to cut everything out. Once done, this is how my puzzle looked like. Let's see if this would work out. Next, I began sanding the edges with my Dremel. This looked already much better. It only required some patience. So after I smoothed out the sanded areas, I carefully melted the foam surface with my heat gun. Heating up the material helps a lot to shape it. See, nice and round. Then I spread on some contact cement and began stacking my foam parts. I used here a mix of the original reference and the video and tried to create something that would work. Now, for shaping curves, I glued one layer onto a thin piece of foam and bended it while connecting both parts. Worked like a charm. I only had to get rid of the excess material next. Super happy with this part. Then more gluing and stacking here and there, and this is how the armor slowly came together. Here I just had to make sure I used the right measurements. But here this was basically the base. Afterwards, I just began adding random details. Some stripes here, some rivets there. It obviously needed to look detailed and technical. Then I made this thingy here as well. The armor seemed to be very random and didn't make much sense, but I actually really liked the design. And by adding some Dremeled in rivets and holes, I could give it at last final touch. Dum dum dum, doing all the drilling. Well, and a good trick is also to cut into those rivets. Then, once we heat them up, they become screws. Ta-da! This was my foam armor build. Very random, very technical, but still pretty cool, I would say. For the next step, the priming, my husband Benny used quick seal to smooth out some gluing seams first. He mostly fixed the roughly Dremeled edges. Afterwards, I grabbed a spray rubber primer and applied several layers onto the foam. Then Benny applied only a tiny bit of silver with his airbrush. This way the armor got a nice shimmer but still stayed pretty dark. Super careful. Benny has amazing painting skills, by the way, that's why he is always helping me here. Afterwards, he rubbed some paint onto his fingers and spread it this way onto the armor. If you ask me, I think that's pretty weird, but he says he has more control this way. Well, and I think the result is pretty convincing as well. So let's go back to kindergarten and paint all with our fingers again. Yay! Cause that's what the pros do. However, at the very end, Benny still grabbed his brush again. Doing these lines with your fingers would be probably still too challenging, even for Benny. And as you can see, he also added some silver highlights so the armor looked more used and weathered. Yeah, it looked pretty fine. Oh, and there was Zelda waiting for her cuddles. Then Benny added some last details and I could finally seal his paint job with a satin spray varnish. And this was how the armor looked like. Attached with double-sided tape at this moment, by the way. I know you are curious. For the attachment, I actually used a lot of hot glue. I first connected these thingies on the front. Afterwards, I covered some Velcro tape with more glue, attached it to the foam, and then sealed the edges. I actually use Velcro for most of my attachments since it's really easy to glue on, holds well, and allows you to jump into a costume quite fast. I only had to mark the area for the counterpiece on the poncho and then sew the Velcro on. See, super easy. The rest of the armor got pretty much the same treatment. Next, I had to add the last details. Yeah, this part was a little bit messy, but nobody knows. Well, except you. Now, psst. Then Benny added more red lines. Oh, and I also should add that I sewed on the scarf onto the poncho but forgot to record it. But here the upper part of the costume was almost done. The buckles were still missing though. I drew here again a rough pattern on paper and traced it onto EVA foam. Benny also offered me to 3D sculpt and print them, but to be honest with you, I like to keep the stuff fast and simple. So instead, I made everything by hand. Cutting all pieces out and sanding all 8 buckles surely took a while. But after I glued everything on piece by piece, I finished all parts actually in just a few hours. Only some little screws and all buckles were done. Next, I primed all parts with spray rubber and Benny gave them a nice red paint job. Again, he faked the chipped paint look with some silver, and this was one of the final buckles. Now only a layer of protective spray varnish was missing. Okay, back to the reference. The game Outriders is set in a post-apocalyptic world, so this outfit had to be worn out, teared up and look pretty dirty. So it was time to give my costume some life. I used my good old trusty Dremel to ruin the edges and even cut huge holes into the fabric. After sewing everything nice and pretty, it's actually quite fun to destroy all of your hard work again. It was just important not to mess up too much, but once done, the costume should look so much better, promise. Next, Benny began messing everything up with the airbrush. This tool is actually quite sweet to create smooth gradients and evenly apply a good amount of paint. Here we really had to consider where dirt would stick on the costume, and therefore Benny spread a lot of colors, especially around the seams and at the bottom. Following this, he grabbed a brush and dabbed dirty paint water onto the fabric. The costume had to look like it was soaked with water and mud. And so I did extra work here as well. Benny was just too worried to mess up the costume, but I wasn't afraid to ruin just everything. Next, I did pretty much the same for the rest of the top. A little bit of Dremel work, and Benny added some airbrush dirt here and there. Not too much though, just a little bit. And once done, I could finally hot glue my buckles on. Yes, they were not functional, but they looked cool. These belts actually hold together with Velcro, by the way. Next, Benny did some weathering on the arm guards. At this point, I think I don't need to mention that the costume actually smelled like a spray paint booth. And more acrylic paint. Benny tried to make everything look very dirty and muddy, so used a lot of olive, brown and beige colors. And I did some cleaning afterwards to make sure it would look alright at the end. Well, and here is the before and after footage. I think the difference is quite convincing, right? Totally love a good weathering effect. It makes the whole costume far more believable. Next, it was time for the pants. Oh, I hate sewing pants. So again, I got my fabric, traced my patterns and cut out all shapes. And after I clipped and sewed everything together, I noticed again that my sewing skills are crap and that the fabric I chose was not stretchy enough for my fat legs. I hate sewing pants. So instead, I bought some pants in a shop and they were perfect for this costume. So, just had to get rid of the pockets. Crappy pants. Sorry if I get a little bit emotional here. Next, I made these coverings for the hips. You know already how I made them, right though? Then I clipped some black pleather straps and sewed along the edges. This is actually how I made all my belt thingies. These ones were then covered with more lovely fabric glue, placed onto the hip coverings and little more glue here and there. See, I told you this glue is pure magic. And then I sewed everything properly on. I also made a belt, which worked very professionally with Velcro tape. Afterwards, I roughly placed these hip thingies with more fabric glue, magic, told you, and and added even more sticky stuff and pressed everything on nice and pretty. Ta-da! Then for the knee part, I made a rough duct tape pattern, and here is the finished sewn piece. For the gaiters, I simply cut out a square of fabric. I finished the top and bottom edges first and glued it onto the knee piece. Then I cut out more from my blue metallic fabric, folded the edges around, and got this result then. This is like a random thing that belongs to the gaiters, but I think it made this whole part far more interesting. I added here more leather strips, glued on the folds, and placed a proper seam here as well. So far so good. Afterwards, I could finally fold the gaiters over, clip the fabric, and finish the seam on my sewing machine. Well, and these were the finished gaiters. I made them actually a little bit too short, so I added an extra piece of fabric at the bottom, professionally glued on. Finally, I pulled them up and spread glue onto the knee parts. Glue was obviously not the only thing that held my pants together. At the very end, Benny patiently hand sewed all around the green fabric to make sure everything stays in place properly. Well, and this was then the result. The pants fit just perfectly, and I think these little adjustments made them even better. Now only some weathering was missing. Again, I ruined the fabric a little bit with my Dremel, especially at the bottom. After trying to sew really nice and clean, this step feels a little bit weird though. Afterwards, Benny tried to cover up the dark spots of the removed pockets. Well, and the rest was done with the airbrush as well. As you can see, the ripped off fabric became pretty bright, but the paints easily fixed it. Benny darkened everything again, especially the seams and the teared up areas. Afterwards, we both added a lot of dirty paint water. Especially the bottom had to look soaked and ugly, so we did quite some effort here. Now for the shoes, I actually used my everyday doggo walkie shoes. They were already pretty dirty and well weathered, so they fit perfectly. Well, and here are the finished pants. I love how ugly they look now. Adding weathering really turns a costume into a believable outfit, and I think Zelda agrees. For the finished costume, I decided to create this hairstyle from the character creator. So I grabbed an old brown wig I still had left over from a previous project, shortened it a bit, cut it here and there, and added braids and stuff. I was actually also too lazy to make some gloves. So I grabbed some super old training gloves I had laying around somewhere. Cosplay recycling. So, finally it was time for a proper photoshoot. I did my very best to apply a post-apocalyptic makeup. Does this look post-apocalyptic enough? And threw my wig on. Just had to glue on the lace front properly. And this was me fully dressed up. The costume turned out super comfy, had a great fit, and I think it looked straight out of the game. Benny did a great job on the weathering, and I think in general it has a really cool design. Good job, Outriders team! And it looked even better with the Grim Marrow in my hands. I'm so happy how everything turned out. For the dressing test photoshoot, we used only a grey background, but Benny and I try our best to find a proper photo location for later. But so far, I'm really satisfied with the work Benny and I did on this project.
Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and especially thanks so much to Square Enix and the team of Outriders for asking us to create the Grim Marrow and also the outfit. Benny and I, we had a lot of fun to create everything from scratch. It was a really cool project, and I think the design is really cool and awesome. And I hope you as well liked it as well. And yeah, now that I'm finally done with creating the costume, I cannot wait to try out the game myself, because I was very busy crafting before. So I'm probably going to play the Trickster, because this class looks very interesting. And yeah, if you also played the game so far, let me know in the comments. how you like it. Yeah, and if you have any questions regarding to the project and the costume, let me also know in the comments. And if you have no idea what to write down in the comments, write down Corgi to support us with the YouTube algorithm. Join the Corgi squad. So, and yeah, you probably wonder about the tools and materials we used, and as always you can find links for everything in the video description down below. And other than that, thanks so much for watching. Like and subscribe, hit the notification bell, and support us on Patreon, right? And yeah, see you very soon in the next video.